A symphony of iron and blood, the grand and brutal opera of the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. In the mid-19th century, the United States of America, a teenage nation full of ambition and just as many flaws, decided to celebrate its coming of age by tearing itself in two in the most gruesome fraternal conflict in its history. The American Civil War was not just a series of ferocious battles. It was the giant, festering boil of deep-seated economic, social, and moral contradictions that had been swelling within America for decades, and it had finally burst. This is the story of a nation with schizophrenia, of clashing ideals, of extraordinary courage mixed with utter madness, and of boundless sacrifice from which, out of the ashes of its own making, a new America would be reborn. The fire that foretold the storm, when two neighbors can no longer live together. The seeds of this great war had been planted long ago, rooted in the fundamental differences between the North and South, regions as different as if one came from Mars and the other from Venus. The North was a dynamic young man, on his way to becoming an industrial tycoon. Factories sprouted like mushrooms after rain, spewing black smoke into the sky, and a spiderweb of railroads created a vibrant economy based on free labor and a bustling bourgeoisie. Northern society was a melting pot, with waves of immigrants from Europe bringing with them progressive ideas and a belief in a strong federal government, a big boss who could run the whole show. In contrast, the South was an old conservative gentleman living in a traditional agricultural society. This gentleman's economy was almost entirely dependent on a plantation system of cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. White gold, cotton, was the uncrowned king, and its throne was built upon the backs of millions of African slaves. For the Southern slave-owning class, slavery was not just a lucrative business model. It was the very foundation of their social order, their culture, and their so-called aristocratic honor. They clung to the idea of states' rights, a very high-minded phrase that usually meant the right to do whatever we want, especially keeping our slaves, and feared a central government that might stick its nose in and abolish their beloved, peculiar institution. The issue of slavery was the great geological fault line, just waiting to cause an earthquake. The abolitionist movement in the North grew like a storm, condemning slavery as an inhuman crime, a slap in the face to the Declaration of Independence. Meanwhile, the South not only fiercely defended it, but also sought to expand this special merchandise into the new territories of the West. Every time a new piece of land was annexed, the question of whether it would be a free state or a slave state would ignite the flames of debate in the political arena, much like a sensational reality TV show. The final straw that broke the camel's back was the presidential election of 1860, the season finale of this long-running political drama. Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the Republican Party with a platform of no further expansion of slavery, won the presidency without a single electoral vote from the South. For the Southern states, Lincoln's victory was nothing short of a declaration of war. They believed the White House had now fallen into enemy hands, and the only way to protect their superior way of life was to move out and live on their own. Starting with South Carolina in December 1860, Southern states declared their divorce from the Union, forming a brand new nation called the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their president, and establishing their capital in Richmond, Virginia. The United States had officially broken in two. The opening shots in the early years of disillusionment, 1861 to 1862. At dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. Those cannon shots were the opening bell for the bloodiest boxing match in American history. President Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he called a rebellion. Both sides were fired up, naively believing the war would be glorious and over by Christmas. They were dead wrong. The first battles showed that this would be a surprisingly even contest. The North had a massive advantage on paper, in population, 22 million versus 9 million, of which nearly 4 million were slaves, industry, finance, and railroads. However, the South possessed a roster of more talented and experienced generals, the brightest star among them being Robert E. Lee, a true military genius. Southern soldiers, fighting on their home turf, also had a higher morale, defending their families and their land. The First Battle of Bull Run, July 1861, was a bucket of ice-cold water dumped on the North's confidence. The Green Union volunteers were routed, sent fleeing for their lives back to Washington in a chaotic mess. This battle sent a clear message. This would be no picnic. On the Western Front, the Union's Ulysses S. Grant began to emerge as a steadfast and decisive commander. He was the type of man who spoke little and just got things done. He won crucial victories, seized control of vital riverways, and paved the way for the Union Army to push deep into enemy territory. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the mighty Union Army of the Potomac was repeatedly being pummeled by Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The Union commander, General George McClellan, was a brilliant organizer but overly cautious, like someone who plans the perfect party but is too afraid of guests dirtying the house to ever send out the invitations. He consistently missed golden opportunities to destroy Lee's army. The war also raged at sea. The Union Navy, with its overwhelming strength, implemented a blockade of southern ports, the Anaconda Plan. This was the squeeze of a giant python, slowly but surely choking the life out of the southern economy. The year 1862 was a year of bloodbaths, especially the Battle of Antietam in September. General Lee invaded the North for the first time, hoping a victory would convince Europe to recognize the Confederacy. The battle lasted only a single day but claimed over 22,000 casualties, becoming a day where death itself had to work unpaid overtime in American military history. The result was a tactical draw, but it forced Lee to retreat and, more importantly, gave Lincoln the perfect pretext he had been waiting for. The turning point, when the game changed. Seizing the strategic victory at Antietam, on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This was not just a document. It was a spectacular flipping of the chessboard. The proclamation declared that all slaves in the rebellious states shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. This act completely transformed the meaning of the war. It was no longer a war to reunite the Union. It had become a crusade for freedom. Militarily, it opened the door for the enlistment of African Americans. Over 180,000 black soldiers would fight bravely, contributing significantly to the final victory. Diplomatically, it was a masterstroke. Britain and France, which had already abolished slavery, could hardly openly support a nation fighting to preserve it. The summer of 1863 was the decisive moment, with two resounding Union victories occurring almost simultaneously, sealing the fate of the war. In the East, General Lee, after a brilliant victory, once again marched north, making an all-in bet. The two colossal armies collided at a small town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. The battle lasted 3 days, July 1st to 3rd, and was the largest and bloodiest of the entire war. Its climax was the suicidal Pickett's charge on the final day. The disastrous failure broke the spine of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee was forced to retreat and would never again have the strength to launch a major offensive. At the exact same time, in the West, General Grant completed a masterful siege campaign at Vicksburg, Mississippi. On July 4th, one day after Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrendered. It was the most bitter birthday gift for the Confederacy. This victory gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two and tightening the deadly python's coils. These twin victories marked the irreversible turning point of the war. The South's hope for victory was extinguished. Life within the war, the suffering home front. The Civil War was not just for soldiers. For them, life was a one-way ticket to hell, where disease killed more men than enemy bullets. Poor sanitation turned army camps into breeding grounds for epidemics. Medical care was primitive. Amputation was a daily routine. On the home front, the North faced inflation and draft riots, but its industrial economy held firm. In the South, the situation was a catastrophe. The blockade caused shortages of everything. People had to learn to make soup from tree bark and coffee from dandelion roots. Women took on all the work, living in constant fear as the war drew closer. They served as nurses, charity organizers, and even as spies or disguised soldiers. For the slaves, the war was the light at the end of the tunnel. Hundreds of thousands fled, seizing the chance for freedom. Their journey was perilous, but the thirst to be human gave them strength. Total war and the final knockout, 1864 to 1865. In 1864, Lincoln finally found the general he needed, Ulysses S. Grant. Appointed general-in-chief, Grant brought a ruthless philosophy. A war of attrition, also known as meat grinder warfare. He decided to wage total war, targeting not only the enemy army but also its economy and morale. In the East, Grant engaged Lee directly. Despite horrific losses, Grant never flinched, constantly applying pressure and forcing Lee into a defensive siege around Richmond. Meanwhile, in the West, General William Tecumseh Sherman executed his legendary March to the Sea. This was the most epic destruction tour in history. His army cut a swath of destruction through Georgia, destroying everything that could support the war effort, with the stated goal to make Georgia howl. In late 1864, Sherman's victory at Atlanta helped Lincoln win re-election, dashing the South's last hopes. By early 1865, the Confederacy's fate was sealed. Its armies were disintegrating. Its economy was in ruins. Richmond fell. Lee was forced to run. The historic moment at Appomattox and the undying legacy. Hunted and surrounded by Grant's army with no escape, General Robert E. Lee surrendered on April 9, 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse. The moment was solemn. Grant offered generous terms, a surprising slap of decency after years of brutality. He told his men, "The rebels are our countrymen again." Lee's surrender effectively ended the war. But days later, the joy of victory was shattered when President Lincoln was assassinated. A final tragedy in a play that had already had far too many. The cost was staggering. Over 620,000 soldiers died. The South was devastated. But from the suffering, America was reborn. The war affirmed the integrity of the Union and permanently abolished slavery. However, the road to true equality was still long and arduous. The American Civil War is a tragic and complex chapter, a reminder of the fragility of a nation and the price of freedom. It is a story of destruction and rebirth, a bloody symphony that shaped modern America, a nation that under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Thanks for watching.